Hey guys, Naz here. So today I'm going to be taking you through how I extract a pattern to use with EVA foam. So you might have seen on my Patreon that I've been making the life-size Crash Bandicoot. He's about 5 foot tall. So instead of making him in the traditional plush method, I've decided to make him out of hollow EVA foam for a couple of reasons. One, because he would just be way too heavy if I decided to make him out of plush, and two, it's easier for me to create these complex shapes and have them hold themselves over time made out of that lighter foam. So the first thing you want to do is you want to get your base model that you're going to be extracting the pattern from. Today I'm going to be extracting the pattern of this ear just to show you as an example, but if you go back to my Patreon and look at some pictures, you can see that I've done this for the entirety of Crash. So here I'm using a 3D printed model that I modelled of him to extract the pattern, but you can use clay, you could use foil, you could use whatever shape you want to extract the pattern from. The only difference is if you're using something that's not like hard plastic or something like that, if you're using clay or something soft, you want to just wrap it in plastic wrap before you start this taping process. So what you're going to need is you're going to need some masking tape or painter's tape. You can use duct tape if you're using it on a larger model, but I prefer to use masking tape here. It's just easier to sort of manipulate into those fiddly shapes on this smaller scale, but do whatever works well for you. So you want to cut your tape into lots of thin slivers. This is a very small piece that I'm extracting the pattern from, so you want to use smaller pieces of tape for smaller objects, bigger pieces for bigger objects. You just don't want to be mushing that tape onto the shape too much, trying to force it. You want it to sort of naturally curve around and not be too bulky, because that's going to help capture the overall shape that you're trying to extract better. When you're laying this tape down, you want to do at least 3 layers, especially with the masking tape, because it is a little bit thin. This will just make sure that when you pull it off, it's going to stay as one nice sturdy piece. If you only did 1 layer, it would just break apart the second that you tried to cut it off your model. So I'm going here and I'm putting in lots and lots of horizontal strips you might be able to see. And then the next layer I'll do lots and lots of vertical strips and then horizontal again, or vice versa. You really want to not have all your tape going the same way throughout the entire taping process. You want to vary the overlaps and the direction of the tape that's going to take. This is just going to make sure that it bonds to itself better, and it's going to be a lot more sturdy when you eventually cut it off your model. So once all your taping is done, you're going to take a pen and you're going to start marking where you're going to cut your seams. This gets a bit easier the more you practice, and if you have some experience working with plush, which I assume most of you will have some sort of experience, you'll sort of get an idea of where those seams need to be. So mostly at your biggest ridges and your biggest sort of intersections, you can sort of put those baselines. If you're not really sure, just do those parts and then sort of cut it off, and you'll be able to see where we need to cut it to lay flat later. So you don't need to put all your seams in to start with, you just want to put sort of the obvious ones, and you can get different results putting seams in different places. So yeah, it does take a bit of trial and error and a bit of an educated guess as to where to put those seams. We will be adding a fair few darts later, especially on organic shapes like this. It's a little bit more of a complex shape, but we'll do that once we've actually cut this pattern off here. So you can see he sort of has this crest at the top of his ear. I'm putting a line there. Try to make sure that your lines are really obvious where they're going and where they intersect. You might want to put little notches where different seams are intersecting, just so you can remember. And you want to be marking your pattern as much as possible with lots of little lines to help you align everything. So little notches that go over these seam lines, so that when you're gluing the bigger pieces together, you can line them up much better using those little notches. It's really better to just go overboard with your labeling rather than go under with it. So you really want to be marking what part of the ear is this. Is this the front? Is this the back? Is this facing near the point? Is this facing near the base? Because once you cut these pieces off, it can become a little bit confusing as to where they go. So One thing I would also recommend is taking heaps of photos while you're doing this labelling, so that when you have to put it back together, you know exactly which piece goes where, because yeah, it is really confusing sometimes when you think, oh, what's this sort of long squiggly shape, where does that go? So here I'm going to be labelling the front inner ear, the back inner ear, the front of the top, the facing piece, the piece that's facing us, sorry, the back, and then the back of the ear, and that's broken into multiple parts. So really, the more marking that you can do and the more labelling you can do, it's going to make it easier for yourself later on. So after we've marked all our seams, we're going to start cutting the tape off our base. Now obviously, take a lot of care when you're using a sharp object to cut. You can use something like a tiny pair of scissors, and I also use a little blade just to lightly sort of scour those lines to make it a little bit easier for me to get my scissors underneath. It's a little bit easier when you're working with clay because you can sort of cut into the clay. It may ruin your original sculpt, just keep that in mind. But you can see here that I'm cutting each seam, sort of neatening each piece up as I go, and after this we're going to start finalising them and making sure that they're going to translate with all their curves and darts that we need to add in. So yeah, just be really careful. Sharp objects are sharp, so be careful. If you need to wear some safety gloves or something like that during this process, that's fine as well. But yeah, respect those blades, and if you're under 18, ask your parents' permission first so I don't get in trouble for telling you to use sharp objects. But really just cutting out along all those seams, and then we're going to start laying all our tape flat on like a surface like a table or something like that, and that's going to show where we need to add darts. So you can see that I've released most of the ear. I'm going to start adding some darts to these pieces. Sometimes it's easier just to get your larger pieces off and then you can cut seams, like you can see that I've taken half of the ear off and then I'm cutting that seam there. So now what we're doing is anywhere that there's sort of a rise or a bulge, we're going to want to be cutting either a dart in that, or we're going to want to cut along where that sort of starts to rise. So you can see on this ear piece, this is the back of the ear, I've laid it flat as much as possible, and where it starts to rise, I'm going to add another seam, because we're going to have sort of this undulation on the back of the ear. So I've just put in markings, put in where that sort of change in that shape occurs, and I'm cutting those apart, and you can see now they lay flat. So your goal is to make all your pieces be able to lay flat, because then those darts and adding those curved pieces together is what's going to create that organic shape later on. So lay your piece flat. Anywhere that there's a bulge or a curve, you can either cut darts, or as I mentioned, you can add another seam where you sort of think that the intersection of those sort of organic shapes is going to be. And as long as you have your piece laying flat, that should generally make the same shape as you have originally. Sometimes you may need to add more than one dart. You might need to add a couple of smaller darts if you have sort of a curve that runs along a long piece, just like that one I just did there. And then you're going to start scanning them and cleaning them up. Most of the time you're going to be making these bigger than they are originally, so I printed that crash at a quarter scale, so I'm going to be blowing this pattern up 4 times to get it the final size that I would like. So I'm just bringing this into Photoshop and I'm tracing over everything, making my lines all nice and neat, copying all those little markings that are in there, and then I'm going to be blowing this up digitally 4 times, the original size, printing that out, and then I'm going to start by cutting those pieces out of EVA foam. So we're going to grab our EVA foam here. The EVA foam that I'm using here is probably about 5mm thick, because this is going to be a very large piece. It's a very large ear. If you're making something smaller, you would scale your EVA foam down. If you're making something bigger, you might want it thicker. It kind of just takes a bit of trial and error and a little bit of guesswork as to how thick a foam you're going to need. If you need it to be really sturdy, definitely go with something thicker, but just remember that your thicker EVA foam can be harder to sort of contort and to work with because it is so chunky. So you're going to have an easier time bending something that's slightly thinner. So just have a think about what you need for your project. You might need to make something, decide maybe the foam you've used is too flimsy, go with something thicker, or maybe it's the other way around, you need to go with something thinner if you've used something that's too bulky. You can buy EVA foam online in a lot of cosplay supply stores. There's a couple here in Australia. One that I buy from is called the Hero Studio, but I'm sure you guys will have a bunch overseas just under different names. You can buy really beautiful just plain sheets of EVA foam. If you can't find it, you can also use things like floor mats, which you find at hardware stores. They can often be made out of EVA foam. The only thing is, some of the time you're going to have sort of a rough or textured backing on those, so you might need to sand that off, or you might need to have that on the inside of your piece so you can't see it, but that's a cheaper way to get EVA foam as well. Personally, I like to buy the grey stuff. The cosplay supply store that I buy from, you can either buy it in black or grey. I personally prefer grey just because it's much easier to mark on. When you're marking on black, you're going to need to use something like chalk or a silver Sharpie or a white pen, and I find that a lot of those pens run out super quickly, so that's just not something that I want to be bothered with. I also find it easier to see what I'm doing with the grey foam. So you might not be able to find it, but if you can, that's just my personal preference, and you might like something different for what you're working on. So now that I've got all my pieces marked out, trying to conserve as much foam as possible, I'm going to start cutting them out. And what I like to do is I like to just cut the rest of the large sheet away, so I'm not dealing with that bulk. So personally, what I use is just some really sharp little blades that I sandwich between paddle pop sticks. This can definitely be dangerous. These are really sharp. You can also use things like X-Acto blades, but you want a nice sharp little blade, or a longer blade depending on what you're using. But again, ask your parents' permission if you're under 18 to use something like this, and definitely be careful. I've surely cut myself a bunch of times using these, so they can be incredibly sharp. But the thing is, you want them to be sharp, because if they're not sharp, you're probably going to be putting a lot of effort in trying to drag it through that foam. It's going to give you poor cuts, and it's also going to increase the chance that you're going to be putting a lot of pressure on it, trying to really cut through that foam, and it might slip, and then you're probably more likely to actually cut yourself. If you feel like you need to wear something like safety gloves, that's definitely an option, but be really careful. So most of these lines we can just cut straight up and down. You want to try and keep your cut nice and flush, but if we're going to be doing something like a sort of sharp meeting point, like the inside of these ears, they're sort of curving this really concave shape, you can do things like cutting at a 45-degree angle, either sloping from the top out or sloping from the top under, so you can have an undercut or an overcut. So you can use those to your advantage if you want sharper sort of intersection points. So here for the inside of this ear, I'm cutting from ramping from the top outwards and down. So it's, I guess, whatever the opposite of an undercut is an overcut. I don't know if that's a real word, but that's going to, when you glue these pieces together, help with that concave shape. And you can do the opposite if you want a sharper outward shape. You can do an undercut, and that's really going to help when curves are pushed together to give that more severe sort of line. So you can see that my blade's starting to get a little bit dull here, kind of a pain in the butt. You can either use a sharpener or you can use another blade, especially if you're using like an X-Acto blade. You can just pop off the tip of that blade and it will have a new sharper one underneath. But then I'm just going to pretty much go ahead and cut all the rest of these out. With the darts, I almost always undercut them because you want to accentuate that curve, that upwards push that they give to your piece of foam. So that's just a general starting point for when you're cutting out your pieces and which direction to follow. If you've got something like a bandsaw, you can also use that to cut out foam. I have one, but it is ridiculously hot today. I think it's meant to be something like 40 degrees Celsius, which is over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, so I don't want to go outside to use the bandsaw, so I'm just going to use a whole bunch of blades to get this done. But the cleaner your cut, the better. It's going to glue together more cleanly. You don't need to worry about it being absolutely perfect if you're going to be covering this with something like fur, which is conveniently what I'm doing. So Crash is going to have his layer of fur all on top of him, and that's going to hide some of, your seams might not be perfectly matched or glued together. That's going to be covered if you're putting fur over the top. But if you're putting something smoother like Minky, you really have to have those seams lined up perfectly and glued really cleanly, because something like Minky is going to show a lot of wrinkles and errors underneath it, much more than a fluffy fur. The next step is we're going to start gluing all this together. I'm using a contact cement, so in the States the recommended brand is Barge. Over here we have a brand called Sika, so you just want something that's a contact adhesive, and you're just going to put a little bit out at a time. And the way contact adhesive works is you're going to put a very thin layer on both pieces you want to push together, so each side of the seam that you're going to be pushing together, and you want to leave that for about 5 minutes so that it dries. You don't want to leave it for longer than that because it can actually dry to the point it won't stick to each other, but you want it just dry so you don't see any gloss on your seams, and then that's the point where you want to push those parts together and that glue bonds to itself like nothing else. If you leave this to dry after you've bonded it, you're going to rip the foam apart before you actually can rip the seams apart. It's super strong. It's similar to stuff that is used to put soles on shoes and stuff like that, so extremely strong, perfect with EVA foam. And make sure to read the safety directions on whatever brand you're using. You might need to be in a ventilated area, you might need to use gloves or something like that, but generally it's not too offensive. Just having a respirator on so you don't smell any of the stinky glue fumes, and being in a well ventilated room is a good start. So I just pour a little bit onto like a plastic surface, and then I use a spare scrap of foam as like a brush to brush that onto the seams. If you use something like a paintbrush, you're only going to be able to use it for about 5 minutes because then it's going to get clogged up by the glue and you'll never get it off. So use something to spread it on that is not very important. I find using just a small scrap piece of foam is the best option. Making sure not to put a whole lot of glue on, because if you put a really chunky layer of glue on, that's actually going to not benefit you. That's going to make it so that potentially that glue can sort of break apart. If you pull it, you want a nice thin layer that's close to your foam and not adding too much bulk in between. So you can see here I've done the darts to start with, then I'm moving on to putting bigger pieces together. It doesn't really matter what order you put it in, it's kind of like putting a plush together. You might want to put the lead pieces together first and then put the side pieces together and then do the gusset or something like that, but just whatever makes sense to you. Obviously try to leave the fiddlier bits for later. For example, I'm doing the outside of the ear and the inside of the ear separately because I know doing that sort of seam where the inner ear meets the outer ear, that's going to be quite tricky. So I'm leaving that till later so that I'm not sort of fiddling more than I need to, because that's going to be a difficult seam to push together. And some are much easier than others. Some are going to take a lot of persuasion. You can also end up using a heat gun. I'll show you guys in a second how I use that, but your EVA foam, you can heat it up with a heat gun and then it's quite malleable, so you can use that to sort of force it into more curved shapes because it does in its nature want to be flat. You can use that heat and then either a hard tool or letting it cool a little bit and using your hands so you don't burn yourself, you can sort of persuade it into more curved shapes. One thing that I will note when you're heating up EVA foam is it releases some unpleasant fumes that you don't really want to be breathing in. So make sure that you're in a well ventilated room or you're outside, which would be even better, and make sure that you're wearing a respirator that is appropriate for those kinds of fumes. So you can see when I'm lining all the pieces up, I'm trying to use those little notches, those little marks that we put in earlier to help me guide where the foam needs to go. Sometimes it won't look like it wants to match up those parts, but you just have to have faith that you need to force that foam to match up those parts a lot of the time. Sometimes you really need to stretch it, or you might need to squash it a little bit, but generally you should be able to get all those notches to line up, even if they do take a little bit of persuasion. So here I had to redo the glue on one side of the inner ear just because I let it dry for too long. So you can always do more thin layers on top. That doesn't really matter. That can actually make it stronger. If you do one thin layer, let it dry, another thin layer, let it dry, and then bond, that can give you sort of a stronger layer, and that's better than doing one thick layer. So you can see here, you can't see I've got my respirator on, but I do. I'm just heating up that inner part of the ear, and I'm using a solid plastic part, which is half of a Christmas bauble, which I found at a craft store, and I'm just using that to push in that inner curved shape to sort of force that seam to curve a little bit more. So you can see that my glue job's not 100%, but I'm not too worried here because I'm going to be putting fur over this and it's going to be all hidden. My crimes will all be hidden, and that's pretty much how I do it. So that's just me making an ear, but you can use this same process for an entire character if you want to. It's just repeating the whole process for a larger piece and in multiple pieces, and deciding where you want to break it up, have it separate, have it together. But you can go see more examples of me using this method on the photos on my Patreon. But I hope you guys learned a bunch from this. I thought it was something handy if you wanted to make an element of a character out of foam rather than making it out of like Minky and stuffing, for example. It's a bit easier if you're making huge shapes or something that needs to be quite sturdy and reinforced and hold its own weight. It's just a bit easier to do it this way. So anyway, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!